charger. To Pholasaí all ward woven Sean up to Gil and the Pagil, the Féile and the Carraige. This is the 10th Féile and the Carraige. And Kieran O'Brolahan, is Kieran in the name? Where's Kieran? Kieran O'Brolahan was made the other day that he recorded and transcribed the first Harry Holland lecture in 2008. So it's the 15th Harry Holland lecture. So bill of us for all the Harry Holland lectures. The first lecture was delivered by Sean McGill, who's now in his early 90s. And Sean did a talk called The Harvest of Talent, which Kieran transcribed, which we've never actually put online. Job So we're overjoyed to have this event here this evening. For anybody who doesn't know Harry, he was an early supporter of Gortnamona. One of the first events we had to establish the organisation up in Gortnamona in 2003. He said to us, you have to build it. This is the first event. Away you go. You have to build it. People who know Harry would have known he was internationalist, he was a socialist, and the theme of the talk each year is always very broad and covers a lot of the topics that Harry would have held very close to his heart, and I've no doubt that he would have felt the same about the talk here this evening. We have Professor Mike Tomlinson in conversation with Eilís Rooney, and for anybody who doesn't know Mike is a friend in West Belfast. I can remember him coming into my house way back in the 80s and bringing us presents home when he was away talking in America.
You weren't even born.
I was all the time. So Mike, in his wisdom, has become a native of West Belfast, and I think the first report that Mike wrote was the Upper report in the 80s, himself and Bill, and he was friendly with our parents, and it's great that we finally have Mike along to give a talk here this evening. And Eilís is also a native of Dermot Hill and a graduate of Spring Hill Community House, and we're showing a film tomorrow evening that actually has the three sisters in one film, which we find unbelievable. So we'll have Deirdre, Eilís and Kate all in the one documentary which we're showing tomorrow evening. But Eilís was also a lecturer in her own right. She's also a member of the Constitutional Conversations Group, and we had an event with Eilís there last year, and she also chaired the People's Assembly there last week, I heard, in the Waterfront, and she did a great job of that. So we're going to have Eilís Rooney in conversation with Mike Tomlinson. Instead of taking agus be córa on the gaclinne. So gonna hit you with you when the bill was words to Eilís Rooney agus Mike Tomlinson.
Goodness, Dermot Hill, Mary. Happy days. Mike, I'm delighted to see and following your work for a lifetime, it feels like. Your work on equality, your work in social policy, and sometimes some of your articles that I come across have got a lot of data and figures and references in them. And I've got used to that and sometimes have to look and check all the time and really understand some of what you're writing about. That's just some of your articles.
Do I even understand it?
You do. A lot better than I do. But I'm saying that as a way into the topic for tonight because I'm surprised actually when I saw the title of the topic being Fear and Faith, Social Policy in a United Ireland. So I'm intrigued. Why fear and faith?
Well, I think some of that got a bit lost in translation, but before we get into that, could I say that it's an honour and a privilege to be here with everybody tonight. I'm actually quite surprised that I managed to get through the selection procedure of Fergal and the committee, but I did. But in particular, I'm pleased to be here at an event that marks the life of Harry Holland. Like most of the people in this room, I have very fond memories of calling into the shop, getting my vegetables. Always good vegetables, always good crack, always a smile on his face, and always great politics. So thank you, Harry. So this title has got slightly mangled. I wrote a piece which appeared in this book that was launched at the Ireland's Future event at 3 Arena in Dublin a couple of weeks ago, which started off with a title, Beyond Faith and Fear. social security in the United Ireland, but the editors in their infinite wisdom got rid of the beyond faith and fear. So let me just address that. The faith bit of beyond faith and fear refers to the kind of blind faith that most unionist leaders have in the union. They're not part of the conversation, they don't want to be part of the conversation, because, as you sometimes point out, if they were part of the conversation, then they're beginning to negotiate their way away from the union. So we very, very rarely hear a justification for the union in terms of a monarchy, in terms of first past the post electoral system, in terms of an unelected House of Lords, in terms of an unwritten constitution per se. We occasionally hear references to the UK economy being the sixth largest economy in the world and therefore providing a better umbrella for us all here in the wee north than that tin-pot state down across the border could ever do. So we sometimes hear that. And very occasionally, although less so lately, we hear a justification for the union in terms of the NHS. But given the crisis situation that the NHS is in at the moment, we hear less and less about that. And we might want to discuss some of the recent experiences of coping with, say, the COVID crisis and how that looked north and south, which I got into comparing for a while. So the faith bit is that, on the whole, unionist leaders take the union as an article of faith and they don't see the need to discuss it or to debate it. Some of them will say it's never going to happen. Occasionally they'll refer to the polls and say, well, look, we're nowhere near a majority that indicates that the Secretary of State should call a border poll and all the rest of it. The fear side of the title refers to people in the north looking south and people in the south looking north. And for people in the north looking south, they begin to fear the cost of living. The second highest cost of living in the European Union, 40% higher than the average cost of living in the European Union. Second only to Denmark, so there's a big fear. Does this mean we're all going to be subject to a lot of inflation and a lot of change at the economic level, at the level of standards of living? Of course, there is a huge debate about where standards of living lie in relation to that. Or people look at the housing situation in the south and think, this is dire, this is desperate, we don't want that to be flowing up or to be contaminating us in the north. So you've got those kinds of fears. And of course, the big one people talk about is that we're going to have to pay for healthcare. So those are the kinds of fears that I think people in the north have, commonsensical fears that people in the north have about the Unity project and the south, that they want to see addressed and, if possible, fixed, or some guarantees about before we get near a border poll. In the south, it's a slightly different picture. It's quite often you hear polls being carried out in the south whereby people are asked, do you believe in unity? Do you think unity is a good idea? And people will say yes. Do you think unity is a good idea if you have to pay for it in terms of more taxes? And then people say, or a lot less people will say yes. In fact, it drops below 50%. So you begin to have this scenario being sketched out by some of the pundits saying, well, even if there is a majority in the north, there may not be a majority in the south. You could have that strange situation arising where people in the south who traditionally were naturally in favour of unity are no longer in favour of the unity because they can't face the costs. Now, I think it's a kind of false question to be asking people to basically say you're going to have to pay for the North, because that's not a proven fact. It's a myth which comes from the idea that the North is a basket case economy and costs the British Treasury an awful lot of money. This idea of the subvention is far too great. So I should also say that there's another big fear in the South, and this is echoed particularly in some of the dominant political parties in the South. The Taoiseach actually made a speech which referenced this in the Three Arena, where he said that we need to be thinking in terms of a federal solution, that the North retains its own assembly and parliament. In other words, there's a fear about northern politics contaminating what goes on in the Dáil, that we don't want to import the northern trouble, basically. We don't want it. We don't want it down here. So I think there are fears and there's faith that we have to deal with, and as a committed social researcher and social scientist, I believe that we have an important role to play in trying to produce evidence to address some of these questions. So there's a bit of that in this publication, but that publication itself is based on a journal article that I wrote, and this is most academic work is not available to people. It's behind a paywall. But the Royal Irish Academy has started what they call the ARINS project. ARINS is an acronym for Analysing and Researching Ireland North and South. And there is a journal that they publish academic work through called the Irish Studies for International Affairs. And it's free. You can go to the Royal Irish Academy site and follow through on that. And there's a huge number of articles being put together, basically addressing the questions of unity. Some of them are just bits of comparative work, and some of them take things a bit further. And the reason I got engaged in questions around social policy, and particularly social security, apart from having researched poverty and social security for most of my working life, is that this affects more people than almost anything else, even more than the health sector.
Before you go to that,
Okay.
and that's really a really important point in your paper, just want to let people know what they have to look up
Okay. Okay.
online. Anybody interested, and I think that paper, your Aaron's paper, really merits people in the room who are interested having a look at it. It's called Social Security in a Unified Ireland, and if you just put that into a search engine, you'll get Mike's article for free. You can pay for it. But Mike, the point that you're about to make is that, we're taking something, and I want us to take a look, want everybody to stay on the page in terms of you explaining fear and faith. And just if you can tell us a little of why you had beyond there. What was it you were going to do in the paper? Beyond fear and faith. So.
Well, in some ways, I argue that you're never going to convince some people. If people have faith in something, it takes an awful lot to debunk that. They just hold on to it more tightly, contrary to the evidence and all the rest of it. So, in my view, and this may be a prejudicial view, but in my view, between 25 and 30% of the population are going to hold on to their faith, no matter what evidence they're confronted with.
Yeah.
Now,
these are the people who voted against the agreement.
These are what I call the 29%ers, the 29% of people who voted against the Good Friday Agreement and 6% in the South who voted against the Good Friday Agreement. Those people are always going to be opposed to this kind of compromise, this kind of way forward, and of course the prospect and opportunity that the Good Friday Agreement gives to hold a referendum on unity, a no going back referendum on unity, which is important to emphasise. So this is about addressing people who are beginning to be more open-minded than that, are beginning to break with political unionism and thinking this is a complete dead end. They can see Britain, the British economy, going down the tube since Brexit. Even before Brexit, they can see the decade of austerity stretching kind of long and hard, and there's more of it to come. And they can also see what's going on in the south, comparatively speaking. So if you're trying to look for detailed evidence of why the union is a good thing, you'd be pretty hard-pressed to come up with it at the moment, because the union, and particularly the British political economy, seems to be in disarray. Particularly since Brexit, but even before then, I would argue that it lost its way in many respects as conservatism drifts further and further to the right and becomes more and more divided. So some people can see that, and they're beginning to think, well, what does the alternative look like? And so it's extremely important to provide information that people can look at, and I think there's tremendous knowledge gap for ourselves here in what we understand about how the South works, the economy, social policy, and all the rest of it, and likewise in the South.
And your point is to, whenever health is registered as a major concern for people, you're saying that social policy concern with benefit, welfare benefit.
Yeah, I mean, the detailed work that I've done is on social security, and it's about saying, what would it look like if there's unity? Is it going to be difficult to marry these two systems? These two systems, which actually are quite alike, or at least they were quite alike until we get to the point of the Welfare Reform Act of 2012, which took 4 or 5 years to actually get passed here, because people were opposed to it. They knew what it was about. They knew it meant cuts in welfare. They knew there were aggressive restrictions on people's social rights that had never existed before. So it took a long time before the Treasury were able to kind of impose some sort of compromise, short-term solution through welfare mitigations and all the rest of it. So there's a state pension system, it's contributory, it's exactly the same north and south. If all else fails, there's a social assistance system. There is support for housing, very, very like what we have here. There is support for low wages, so that there's supplements to low wages, very, very similar again. The big difference comes with the introduction of tax credits and the introduction of universal credit, which merges all the needs listing under the British system. But I would have no worries about sweeping away universal credit and the computers that run it, and that we can charge the fortune to program and all the rest of it. So I don't think that is a big deal to do that. Integrating staff and systems is another matter, and I haven't got that far with the analysis. What I've tried to put out there is to do two things. How successful are the systems north and south in dealing with poverty, achieving some floor, some minimum, some kind of adequate level of social justice? And we know that the north is much worse than the south in doing it. There's less poverty in the south. Doesn't mean to say that there isn't poverty, because there is poverty, but it's consistently less over the past 15 years. And that results from two things, which is why I prefer the south to the north. It results from lower income inequality in the south and higher rates of benefit relative to earnings. It's quite simple. It just arises from those those two things. And I demonstrate in the article, you take the major benefits, most of the money in the system, most of the money in the benefit system goes on pensions and payments for children, child benefit, which is still universal in the south, but of course is no longer universal in the north. And I compare the rates of payment for the state pension and the rate of child benefit, just as one illustration. This is not the same as providing fully worked through examples, or indeed an online facility where people could put in their family circumstances and compare what they'd get under the social welfare system in the south and compare it with the north. I don't do that. I just simply compare the value of the state pension and the value of child benefit. Child benefit, which has been hammered over the last 12, 15 years, because the Tories hate it as a universal system and they hate children, basically. We need to edit that bit out.
Edit the truth.
So you have a situation where child benefit for 2 kids, in purchasing power parity terms, this is not just using the exchange rate, but what is this actually worth in terms of what it can buy. And we have these values from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. OECD produces purchasing power parities for the rich countries, so you can actually compare one thing with another. And you're talking about child benefit for 2 kids being 1.7 times more worthwhile in the south than it is in the north. That shows the devaluation. The same with the state pension. And if you take the state pension for a couple, it's 2.5 times more.
And is that taking account of a higher cost of living?
It's saying this will buy you 2.5 times more in the south than in the north. Purchasing power parities.
Tell me this.
So it is taking account of it.
It is taking account. In one of your papers, I read the amount of people in each jurisdiction that benefits from social security, or that requires social security. I'm not sure what word I would use. And it's like a huge amount of the population.
Yeah.
And here's what I want to know. Why is this not registering as a concern and a key issue in the debate about unity?
Well, I think in the north, social security is seen as the enemy of the people. It's not seen as an important safety net, social justice mechanism that we all dip in and out of.
Why not? Why is it not seen as that?
It's just the political culture that's.
I think you mentioned there was a campaign. There was a Tory campaign, really. What was a strategy of mass distress you talked about?
Yeah, that's my label to describe what the Tories did from around about 2010, well, when they came in 2010, and they introduced the Welfare Reform Act. Ian Duncan Smith was behind this, where they decided, having spent a lot of time trying to disguise unemployment by pushing people onto sickness and invalidity benefits, say, well, unemployment's going down, aren't we doing great? They then decided that all those people that they'd driven onto long-term sickness and disability had to be driven into the workforce. So they basically processed everybody that was in receipt of long-term sickness and disability benefits through work capability assessments, if you remember that whole caper that started off round about 2012 onwards. And they did the same thing with DLA when they converted it into PIPs. And there were 2 objectives here. One was, let's get tough on benefit claimants. And there was a whole Tory rhetoric surrounding that. And push people into work where we can, which kind of fuels the productivity crisis in Britain, because you're just pushing people into low-paid jobs, part-time jobs, so you have that kind of, this drives the precariousness of the British economy and employment scene. So you do that, and with the explicit aim of saving as much as possible. It was an austerity measure as well, saving as much as possible in expenditure on benefits. And the same was true of the change from DLA to PIPs. Again, it was processing everybody that was claiming this and denying the benefit. There was an explicit target to cut the number of claimants by 20%. That was the working assumption that went on there.
And this influences how how they all think about welfare.
Yeah.
This is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
Why is it not a concern that we all share?
It was a very interesting moment. I did a podcast on this for the Royal Irish Academy with Seamus McGuinness, the economist at the ESRI, and he jumped in at one point and said, Ireland is not like Britain in this respect in terms of the culture that surrounds the benefit system. The Irish system is more sympathetic to people. It trusts people. If people are sick, they're sick. Yeah, there are processes that check people. People have to be seen by doctors and all the rest of it, but there's not this kind of assumption that everybody's cheating the system and has to be driven back into the workplace, which is very much the core assumption. There's other kind of layers of prejudice. If any of you follow the column that I write for Belfast Media Group, I was talking last week about a pamphlet that Pholasaí Exchange produced, where they were engaging in the unity question by rubbishing the southern economy. So, one way of doing this is not just to say the south can't afford the north, but actually, people who say the standard of living is higher in the south than the north, they're wrong about that. And the other thing is that the southern economy is a mess for different reasons. It's just a tax haven for a few of the giant corporations and all the rest of it. So, but there's a very interesting part of this where it specifically talks about West Belfast as having a kind of benefit culture of being anti-state. And this explains why sickness and disability payments, or the budget for sickness and disability benefits in the north, is so much higher than anywhere else. A few years ago, we were spending £1,470 odd per head of population on sickness and disability benefits in the north. Now, the closest rival to that was Wales, with its history of mining and heavy industry and all the rest of it. And the Welsh budget was about 990 or 980 pounds. I forget the precise figure. So we were 1.5 times, our budget is 1.5 times per head of the population that we're spending on long-term sickness and disability. And there's a question around this, which, if we've got time, we ought to get into.
Yes.
Right-wingers and the Pholasaí Exchange are a hard-right think tank, although they're not the flavour of the month in Downing Street at the moment, which is, it's all Institute of Economic Affairs and Free Market Forum and the Taxpayers Allowance and the anti-green people that seem to have taken over. But Pholasaí Exchange were dominant for the last 10 years. A lot of, government statements were always made with the Pholasaí Exchange backdrop. So they say it's basically people's anti-state attitudes in the north, and the benefit system isn't tough enough on people here.
Yeah.
Now, I think a lot of people we know would argue with that. But if it's less tough than it is in Britain, that's great as far as I'm concerned, because people have been seriously brutalised under the British system, my sister included, in relation to that. So I think this is prejudice rather than facts, because I have an alternative explanation for why it is that expenditure on long-term sickness and disability benefits is as high as it is here.
And I think this is really important, and people in the room will be, I think, I'm trying to think of the word I feel that appropriate to myself reading your work. I was amazed by what you uncovered. Amazed because it seems so obvious what you uncovered when you explain what you've uncovered about the impact of the conflict. But I was shocked too because I haven't heard anyone offer this as an explanation for high levels of disability benefit. And also, if you will bring it into the conversation, Mike, also levels of death by suicide.
Okay. So to put this into a comparative perspective in relation to the South, a fifth of the social security budget, the social welfare budget, they call it social protection, using that European term, a fifth of the budget goes on long-term sickness and disability in the South. In the North, the figure is a third.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is the one area that's very different. We spend slightly more on pensions, which you would expect, because our population profile is slightly older. But all other things are equal, except this particular area. So we have something to explain here. And as you've been indicating, Eilís, my explanation for this is that it's directly associated with the conflict. It's a legacy of the conflict. How do I speak with any confidence about this? I can speak with confidence about this because of two surveys that I and others carried out, population-wide surveys, representative surveys of the population that we carried out in 2002, 2003, and again 10 years later. So the latest data is from 10 years ago, 2012. And I'll just maybe tell an anecdote about this. These surveys were part of UK-wide work that was going on to measure poverty and social exclusion across the UK, using a particular kind of metric and relating people's housing conditions, their health conditions, their psychological conditions, their experience of crime, and all the rest of it, to their social circumstances and their poverty status, which was measured in a much more complicated way than simply using income. So I came up with the bright idea of saying that we can't just do this in this society. We've just had 30 years of warfare, conflict, call it what you like. It's not as if poverty is something separate from what's been going on. Yeah. So we have to
do it differently.
We have to do it differently, and we have to have a module that actually registers people's experience of the conflict. So
were you confident that that would have an impact whenever you put that forward?
I was confident because of the amount of resistance there was to us undertaking this. I'd experienced this in the 90s, in the Lower Ormo, if you remember. We did this work unlocking the Lower Ormo, and I remember one of the public meetings there, and I think I must have been saying something and referring to, people getting shot when they're painting walls and different things, and saying that this was actually part of the experience of being trapped in poverty in a very small area, blah, blah, blah. And I remember, I think it was a doctor or a social worker getting up in the audience and saying, "What has this got to do with poverty? It has absolutely nothing to do with poverty." And it was that kind of poverty is a safe subject which is separate from the conflict, and the conflict is a political subject and it's a kind of completely separate thing. But that's not how we live our lives, is it? So I was saying we have to have a module which registers what happened to people. So after a lot of work and a lot of testing of questions and a lot of investigation of the prevalence of different kinds of of events, we ended up with a list of 21 common troubles events, which included things like people close to you that had been killed or injured, intimidation at work, had you been intimidated out of your house, what had you witnessed in terms of the violence, rioting, had you ever witnessed a killing, shooting, the common events, anybody from the family being close to you, been in prison, had your house ever been raided, if so, how many times, all of these kinds of things. Now, bearing in mind that quite a lot of people on the raw end of the conflict were not there anymore, or else they had fled across the border, or they'd gone to England, or they'd retired to Spain, whatever had happened. You were going to miss some of this,
yes.
but
We'll get a picture.
We were going to get a picture,
Yeah.
and that's what we did. And the last time we ran this out in 2012, I was actually very surprised at the persistence of the conflict effect. You can see it there imprinted on the population. Not so much in terms of poverty, although it's there in deprivation. Deprivation is a term that we use to sort of say the extent to which a household lacks basic essentials. They don't have, 3 or more of these basic essentials. So there's a pattern of conflict experience with deprivation. People who have high conflict experience, they're 1.7, 1.8 times to be in a situation of deprivation compared to people that have no conflict experience, controlling for age and or religion and all those other things. So,
And that comes across if you look at maps, if you look at the Cain map of where conflict happened, conflict events and deaths happened, you see very clearly areas of deprivation are areas where people have most experience of the conflict. But now, just if you can turn the page on that, what I want to hear from you is, whenever you ask people about these experiences, you were able to correlate that with mental health issues.
Yes, absolutely. And just to go back to the kind of the political resistance there was, the very first time we wanted to introduce this module, we were working to an advisory committee of six government departments who were financing our bit of the survey. And they didn't want this at all, and they put up every possible kind of barrier to the use of this module. They said the survey's already too long, it's going to be too expensive. Then they said you're going to be traumatizing people, so you've got to produce a leaflet so that they can phone some local support service. And then they said you're endangering our survey team. They're going to be knocking on doors, asking awkward questions, and to which we said, actually, they're not. They can refuse, they're going to be warned about these questions, they're going to be given the computer, they can work their way through this module if they want, or they can say, no, I don't want anything to do with this, I'm going to find this too upsetting, or whatever the case may be. It got to the point where I managed to persuade them to do a pilot. We had to do a pilot anyway, so 25 people, 25 households were kind of tested, and there was good feedback. Some of the questions weren't quite working, had to be tweaked a little bit and all the rest of it. We ended the debriefing on the pilot, and nobody had mentioned the most contentious issue, which was these questions that they didn't want asked. So I had to sort of say, and what about the troubles questions? And the guy that had conducted the pilot, God bless him, said, oh, no, people really like those questions. They just said, why have we never been asked about this before? That's and so we got away with it. And from then on, so there's very, very clear associations between troubles experience when you aggregate it together and say you score people highly for troubles experience, or they have no experience whatsoever. There's a very high relationship between mental health as measured by a particular psychological test. People at risk of mental illness, anxiety, they're scoring more than 4 points on the GHQ-12 questionnaire. You know, it's a standard instrument that is used by social scientists. And they have, you know, you're talking about 2.65 times as likely to have depression, anxiety, than for people that were nowhere near the conflict at all. And in terms of long-term illness and disability, it's 2.05. You know, it doubles your chance of high troubles experience, doubles your chance of being long-term sick and disabled. So
this feeds into the figures that you're talking about.
This feeds directly into what we're facing here.
Yeah. When I looked at the questions you were asking, you know, troubles related experiences. I mean, I thought of people that I knew. I did it myself, and people that I know who have, you know, devastating troubles experiences. And I thought to myself also, Mike, how do you explain people's resilience and the gift and genius of people in communities that have such high levels of troubles-related experiences? You know, we're sitting in a space here tonight that was the result of a dream and dedication and people who pulled themselves together, who many of them had lots of absolutely devastating experiences of the conflict. And you can replicate that in lots of different projects and initiatives and activism in the most deprived communities. And if I can just, before you come back to that, I mean, the other night at the Waterfront Hall, Anya Hargay addressed, if you like, the genius of working class people towards the end of her speech. And I was really gratified by that, because she said we're very often measuring ourselves by what we don't have, by deprivation, by levels of need, and by poor health, which is absolutely legitimate, necessary. So it's a big bundle of things that I'm rolling your way to think about and think out loud about.
Well, I know from living in this community how resilient people are, and how that resilience is channeled into projects, into the language, into community activity, into sport, and into politics.
Yes.
But we also know people who go under with drink and drugs and self-harm and so on. So it's a very mixed picture. And I mean, I don't begin to try to explain resilience. It's a fairly passive picture that comes from survey work of this kind.
I'd like to turn to yourselves for just a moment or two, and we'll come back to Mike. So I just would like you to make a comment or a question, or, you know, say something. I'd like to hear from you. You've been a great audience in terms of just listening. Thank you.
Just want to say, Mike, I mean, there's amazing work going on just on the whole array of questions that we need to have evidential basis for as we move into this debate. But what's been troubling me for about 10 years is that Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil in particular began a massive charm offensive with the Unionists. And the same has been on at the level of Rotary clubs, business societies in the South. So Jeffrey Tomlinson in 1 year carried out 56 engagements across political and business sectors in the South. So they may not be entering the debate, but capital on this island is already talking. It's formulating its policy for a new Ireland, and the difficulty that we have is in the march towards power by Sinn Féin. They're having to do what Labour did and become the opposition to get into power. They're becoming the reasonable face of acceptable market force liberalism. So you have a huge danger that before we even enter the debate proper, that Sinn Féin will have shed so much of its policies that we'll end up with a centrist coalition of either Sinn Féin and Fine Gael, or Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil and the DUP, or what's left of them. And so how do we tackle that? How do we?
Well, I certainly think that one of the debates is about whether it's a unitary state or it's a federal system is there.
It's a given that it should be a unitary state.
Well, it is to me, and I make the case we need a unitary system of taxation and benefits. Whatever else you do, guys, that there's no point unless you've got a unitary state in terms of taxation. That is where politics is in a socio-democratic society. It's all about the politics of taxation and spend. And of course, where we are here, we're massively removed from any of that. And actually, Social Security is a very interesting case, constitutional case in that respect in relation to the North. It's not part of the block grant. Technically, it's devolved. We can do what we want, but if we do what we want, the Treasury will take it back out of the block grant. So we can't do what we want, really. And anytime we have diverged, as we did during the welfare reform discussions, we've diverged with permission of the Treasury. At the same time, they've been fining us, what was it, 187 million one year for not implementing the universal credit computer system and such like. So we're incredibly constrained in terms of social security policy. So it's a given for me that we have to go for a unitary system and we can start debating for real and voting for the people that do our preferred taxation policy and promoting social justice through distribution. There's no hope of getting that out of the union. The union is in such a mess that even if Labour came in 2 years' time, it's going to take them 20 years to recover. And who knows what will be involved in that, whether they'll rejoin the single market or whatever. You know, this is just going to go on for a long, long time before we make any gains on that. I think what's very important to address some of those political questions is to get into things like we need to know what tax would be raised in the North if we apply the Irish tax code. That's what I try to do in the article. Yeah. I say, okay, what does the PAYE system look at different points in the income spectrum in the North? If you apply the British tax code and you apply the Irish tax code, this is actually quite interesting because people can see whether they're going to be better or worse off as a result of this. And I think facilities like that, if we engineer a facility, an online facility where people can do this, they can put in their gross income in the North, they convert it to purchasing power parities, they can apply the Irish tax code to it, they can see what their take-home pay is, and you know, they can see whether they're winning or losing as a result of that. On my estimation in this article, the bottom 70% of earners on the PAYE system would gain between 12 and 20 euros a week by being part of the Southern system. The top 30%, who are probably, possibly, on class grounds going to vote against unity, I don't know, would be slightly worse off, but not a lot worse off. People at the 80th percentile would be something like €50 a week worse off, but you know, they're taking home a lot of money anyway, so they're hardly going to notice €50. It's probably breakfast for them.
Do you have any answers? I'll pick up on another. Do you have any answers to that yourself? I'll tell you what I'm thinking of. How do you change a discourse, you know, in a whole society, North and South? And what I'm thinking of is that social protection is what's called in the South, and it's a better term for it, but it's not a popular idea at all, is it? Even amongst working class people, social security and the protection of social security doesn't seem to be a very popular vote winner. I'm wondering, do you have any ideas in this? And before I turn back to you, I'll just give you an example. The 8th Amendment changed and turned around the discourse across the South. And it's very interesting to look at how they did that and how they got women who had experience in the media up front, and of course it was a relatively popular media issue. I think I would say that's true. But they changed the discourse, and it's worth looking at how they did that, because I do think that there's a job to be done to open people's eyes to what actually social protection means and why it's needed. I mean, there's facts and figures that Mike gives about childhood poverty and so on. And those things are very hard to oppose. But how do you make it central? How do you make it really important?
I think that, I mean, the problem with very long, hard, reasoned arguments is that we live in a very instantaneous society. So it's a catchy phrase.
Yeah.
Women's health rather than the right to choose.
Yes.
Just changing the, you know, so just saying protecting women's health
Yes.
is a much better thing than saying, right, sisters, the right to choose.
Yeah.
So the right to a decent life
Yes.
is much better than saying, you know, we need to tax the rich to pay for the poor, or everybody needs to take a hit so that we can lift up the bottom. Because there is a big disparity now and a big ideological shift that's occurred in my lifetime, and that is that the working poor resent social benefit. Take it, they resent it.
It's been a successful campaign, hasn't it?
It is.
I mean, the term Mike here used was the Westminster government, back in welfare reform, were prepared to risk peace here in their war on the poor. There's been a war on the poor and it's been successful.
I think that's what we need to determine, that we need to have a war on poverty.
Yes.
We need to campaign.
A war on waste
A war on
of
whatever way, but I mean, it's that type of argument. Now that type of argument then has to be backed up by the data.
But Jake, you mentioned employers, basically, owners of businesses and all the rest of it. I think they're going to buy into unity for reasons of lower costs, access to the Union and to the European Union, lower rates of corporation tax, particularly since in Britain, it's, you know, there'll be a straightforward class interest, if you like, profit motive for them. They'll also be looking at what is the cost of employing somebody under the Southern Tax Code. So when I talk about a facility for employees and benefit recipients to do calculations as whether they'll be better off or worse off, the same needs to be there for employers so that they can see the cost of employing
You should talk to Martin Miller, he's probably already worked it out.
Any other questions to come back? Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I see some of the danger in the road towards a new Ireland is that it's so politically driven. Then we're not going to end up with structures that we, on the ground, working class people, will see that we're going to particularly benefit from. It won't be built and created to benefit us per se. And would you maybe look at, I come from a trade union background, so we want to benefit the lives of all of the workers within the workplace. We seek to amend the 318, which is your duty description, which details your terms and conditions and everything else, your rate of pay, your hour of pay, and your breaks, the whole structure of your day. We have something similar in society. Look, it's a gap called the social contract. But it seems very obscure, it's very, you know, people aren't wholly aware of it. Now, that acted like a 318, where we could say it's a race-based society. Here's what we want to see within our social contract. We want to see the right to a free national health service, free at the point of delivery. We want to see a living wage. We want to see social housing, the right to housing, or affordable housing, you know. So we want to see those structures as a safety net built in for all citizens, not just so as we're not turning one against another. It's there for everyone. And the whole thing, when if you're in a workplace, you have a means by which you can negotiate this. It's called the industrial relations framework. There's a method to it that could be done. It can also be done here, but the difference of it is that politicians don't seemingly have political will in order to do it. We talk about
relating that kind of trade union perspective to the constitutional question of the union versus United Ireland. What conversations do you hear within the trade union movement about the prospect of furthering a political culture based on rights and trade union representation, looking one way rather than the other? What do you hear? I mean, people in trade unions.
I think they better idea that after next week there is a meeting of the Belfast Business Trades Council meeting, and it's with regards to the relief, the strike, the workers' strike of the 1930s, and we're kept Protestants came together to organise. They're not as organised as what they should be. They're not as radical as what they should be. There's lots more that could be done. It is being talked about, but it's not in a structured manner, and so that structure has yet to come together. But I mean, I would have been a radical trade unionist, a militant trade unionist, so I do tend to think outside the confines, the constraints of the anti-trade union laws that were, that were forced upon us by Thatcher, in which the Irish state and in which the Northern state are quite happy to leave their own statute books, that we can't organise, that we can't, they want to constrain us. And similarly so, in my opinion, if the debate and the discussion on New Ireland is constrained very much within structures that already exist, then they're not going to lift. Like, we see siege on the community that I live in West Belfast and in other parts of the north here. It has never really been lifted. Yeah, the conflict may have been ended, but a new conflict began, Whereas the British Commission of Arms, there was never been commissioning of informants, and that fear of, someone going to, and there is a benefit chase. They were never living a luxurious lifestyle, but everyone looking after over their shoulder. And when we talk about this mental health problems and everything else that is there within our society, it's a legacy of the conflict that seemingly ended but didn't end, respond. So there's a lot of the baggage there that we still carry forward with us. And my fear is that if it's politically driven and politically led, and they are the ones that form the structures of it, well, they didn't make too good a job of it for 100 years. And they haven't. And it really will take new ideas. It'll take new ideas and new creative thinking in order to mould an Ireland that's going to more wholly benefit all of its citizens on a more equal footing.
I think the key thing is public services. If you're talking about unifying a state, the key thing is the integration of public services and what that looks like. And that has big implications for people who work in the public sector or in the privatised public sector. I mean, if you think about postal services, the massive dispute that's going on amongst postal workers, and then you've got An Post, and never the twain shall meet. I use the post a lot because I run a business, and stuff that we send to Dublin goes via Birmingham.
Yeah.
And the only way we can stop people in this, now we're supposed to be part of the same single market, 90 miles down the road, the only way we can stop the customs charges or the post being interfered with by customs when it arrives in Dublin from Birmingham or whatever sorting office it has been sent to, is to put a customs label on it. We're not required to put a customs label on it, but we have to stop customers being charged for that clearance. So that gives you a sense of the orientation of a basic service like the post is totally oriented towards Britain, basically, rather than being a kind of a north-south service. And actually very, very few services are organised on some of the transport services are obviously organised on a north-south basis. But anyway.
Just some very interesting points there. Just spoke about the generational trauma and a lot of the people in this room and their families have been through it. I think now, for the likes of our generation coming through here, we don't fear the state the way our parents fear the state, and our children aren't going to fear the state. We're getting somewhere, but there's a new fear. There's a fear of coming through and us building just to reiterate what he said, a new Ireland without any kind of meaning. So, in terms of building social policy, is there another country or another example, or is there people articulating, now, a social policy that's worth? So you see people like Jake here who've come through, and all that, and Mary, and they've come through their whole life. Is there something there that we can energise people to fight for, and that it's worth fighting for? Because other than that, if we're sitting back and we're just allowing the kind of neoliberals, north and south, to come together and have a United Ireland, it's not enough to make, you know, to whet the appetite, the aspire to fight for something. You know, people need hope. And I would like to think that, you know, people like yourself, and I'm not just advocating that you have to do it, but people like the people in this room are getting together and articulating this is what we want here. We want social policy that meets the needs of people, because the majority of people on this island want a good life, and a good life means, you know, a sense of belonging, health, access to health, an education system that's fair, and people just want to get on with it. But at the minute, that's not there, and I think there's maybe scope for something. Is there any country that...
I mean, what I'm involved in is a boring piece of social administration, trying to work out, you know, how you could put something together. I'm not a hope merchant, you know, you need your politicians for that, to provide the vision and all the rest of it. Obviously, I've got principles, and I think that there's a broader prospect of a better level of a safety net, there's a better level of social justice that can be achieved through unity than through staying grafted on to Britain. Obviously, I believe that. But the kind of grounded research I'm doing is not to develop hope, it's just to say this is actually more possible that the doomsayers, that the partitionists say, you know, they say it's not possible, that can't be afforded, and I'm saying, I'm sorry, but that's not true. It can work, and it will work, and there's a better prospect of developing the things that you want as a result of unity. So, you know, there's a tiny hope bit tagged on the end.
Surely, absolutely vitally important, Mike, I would say, to have data, information, to be able to back it up, to say the things that you're saying, and it doesn't bring you to the land that we all want to go to, but it affirms the values that you've just outlined there, just totally affirms it, that people are looking for a better life.
I would like to see, for example, when the budget is being prepared in the south, I would like a shadow budget to be prepared, including the north, which involves estimating what the tax take and what the expenditure is going to be of incorporating the north. So again, the Irish tax code applied to the north. Now, this is not an easy thing to do, but it's something I'm starting to work on with others at the moment. Can we come up with a good estimate of what that would look like? Because the Treasury in London doesn't know what the tax take is from here. It's all based on estimates. Nobody has a clue really, because it's not as if there's a local tax office that counts the money, you know, takes the corporation tax. So we know some things quite accurately. We know national insurance contributions quite accurately, and income tax quite accurately. But things like VAT, who knows? So a lot of these things are based on kind of population estimates and just kind of dividing it up, and that's why the Fiscal Commission report is quite interesting in relation to this, that was published recently. But that's the route that nerds like me are going down. You know, we're thinking, what is the North worth? Don't just treat it as being a cost that nobody can afford. It actually produces a lot of taxation as well.
It's a contributor.
Sorry, it's a contributor. Exactly. So that's what you need to start building into shadow budgets, basically. You know, I think that would be. Now, some people say no, it's far too early for anything like this. It's far too grounded. You know, we've got to persuade people of the idea. Well, I'm for getting on with it.
Can I remind people here who are having their say and coming across with such critical and hard-hitting views and aspirational views as well, that the Waterfront Hall, the Belfast People's Assembly, and politically driven, but open to people who are not involved in politics, that there's a website, it's on the Sinn Féin site, that if you choose to, you can submit your views and your ideas to that and your proposals. And people are doing that. Somebody contacted me about education. with really visionary ideas about future education, north and south. And it was marvellous, you know. But it's just a way, rather than feeling that you're not heard and you're not going to be listened to, you know, if you choose, there's a way to have your voice heard.
To just say, I mean, just back to it, I would think that sectorally, anyone within a sector, I mean, I've already our submission and run the Gael for it. I think that each sector should put in their submission, and it should all be framed around, in my view, a charter for a better life. And you just simply say, I mean, I simplified it right now to saying, let's implement what was on the 1916 proclamation. But I mean, we need to just carry out that. So trade unions should be putting on it, single branches can put it in, individuals. And there's a really good way to feed all of that in to a central point. It's a pity it's just Sinn Féin doing it, because that puts a lot of people off getting near it. Yeah. But, I mean, swallow it and put it in.
Yes.
It's just a couple of points. I think there is a danger of this conversation happening at a political level only, and civic society and the element of civic society that's out of the traps first in terms of political is it the Ireland's spirit, Ireland's future stuff. It's really important. But it is a particular strand of civic nationalism who are doing okay. And if you think I think there's models out there and there's lessons from our past. So if you think about, for example, the period maybe from the late 80s and maybe the Irish ceasefire in 94 and 1998, it was communities that were beginning to have the conversations around the type of communities that we wanted to build. Right? So there was something around what type of, can't wait on the conflict on one, we need to build Balmerford now. So people began doing that. One of the things that then happened after 1998 is that we almost lacked the type of political vision and social vision that we wanted sort of take place at a political level. So it was only political parties who were involved in that. It was like almost like a 10, 15-year negotiation in which the rest of society wasn't involved in it. And because we were afraid of wrapping the peace, we sort of just get on with doing what we're doing. So I think we're in a similar period now. And as communities, I think, need to become involved in this conversation. And it was brilliant. It was really interesting at the Ireland's future. The three biggest applause on the day came from those people who spoke with a left-wing perspective. The girl from People Before Profit, the Traveller, they got really rapturous applause. There's a real thirst for a new and radical Ireland. But with all the greatest respect to Sinn Féin and Ireland's future, if we leave it to them, we're going to get a unity state, and we're going to get a bit of what we've always got. So we need to begin to start this conversation. So you get involved in the Ireland's future, get involved in the Citizens' Assembly. But what we need to do, I think, locally in North Springfield, we need to do our own. We need to have our own Citizens' Assembly. We need to get the people in this room and outside this room having a conversation about what does Ballymurphy and Ballymun look like in a new Ireland? What's the schooling system like? What's our opportunities like? What's our health system like? And we need to begin that discussion sort of fashion. Because again, there's another really sort of good example. And Drumjar and Bloor and Mona are a really good example of how the macro-political and the micro-political operates. And Drumjar and the campaign for Irish Language brought down Stormont at a macro-political level. But it only happened because Jeremy the Bruder is in school teaching kids every day, and Padraig Hall is teaching kids, and Orlane Shapley's away with kids snappers on Tuesday night, Thursday night, and Friday night. And they're doing that week in, week out, year on year, and then the opportunity arises. So there's something in that now. We need to be building the types of communities that we want now. And we need to be having that conversation now. With the view that once this opportunity comes, we're going to have to strike and make sure that the voice of the real people, that's why the people of Ballymurphy, for example, are involved in that conversation.
Thank you very much. Before we'll do an all-round cheer at the very end. Before I hand over to Mike for the last word. I do want to say that I know people in Ireland's future and people in Sinn Féin who share the visions that are being articulated here tonight and who helped to make us what we are. you know, and who have the fight on the inside that you're talking about now, and who want to mobilise the fight that you're talking about now. And you know, one of the people in the past, a man I loved dearly, was Father Des Wilson, and I just want to give a plug for an event for his legacy. It's going to be on tomorrow. At what time? The 21st at 1 o'clock here. Is that right? Friday, sorry. Friday, 1 o'clock here. And there's an example of the very things that you're talking about. It was just one house, a couple of individuals, and look what they did, and look what they made, and contributed to making peace. Absolutely, you know, it's a story to be told, and it will begin to be told on Friday here at 1 o'clock. Over to yourself, Mike, for the last one.
Oh, the last word. Wasn't really expecting that.
You're not listening. I warned you. But we're around about the time.
I think I've already said where I think some of the work that I've been doing is going. I think it's important because a couple of years ago, just prior to COVID, nearly 3 years ago, I started to work on this because I was very frustrated by the conversations, I hate that word actually, but the discussions that were going on, the debates that were going on, referencing unity, never referred to taxation and never referred to the benefit system, never ever. Education sometimes came into it, the health service often came into it. But that was about it. The rest was all about the design of political systems, what would happen with the law, what were the terms and conditions of the Secretary of State to call a referendum. You know, on and on it went, really. And I was thinking, nobody's really talking about one of the things that affects most people on a day in, day out basis, and that is the benefit system, whether you're in work or you're out of work. This is the kind of the stuff of life for most people, and it's avoided. And I decided to take it on, so I started researching it. I started trying to apply the Irish tax code, social insurance system, universal social charge to people to kind of use that as a kind of case study of what it actually looks like. And I think we need to develop from there to make facilities very easily followed, online facilities, so that people can, in a very, very basic material way, not in a dreamy political way, but in a very basic material way, they can see what the implications of a unitary state as things stand at the moment. And I'm not defending the status quo or saying we shouldn't reach much further beyond that, but I'm talking about reducing the fears and developing the hopes that people might have around the Unity project with very, very practical steps that people can use at the level of the individual, at the level of employers, and at the level of state budgets, by talking about what is the total tax take and how that might look under the Irish tax system. So that's me, that's where I'm at.
Let's put our hands together.